You wake to the sound of bells cutting through darkness like a blade through silk. Your breath forms clouds in the frozen air of the dormitory, and your small hands shake as you pull the rough woolen habit over your head. You are 7 years old. Your feet, bare against the stone floor, have long since stopped feeling the cold. Around you, 20 other girls move in perfect silence, their faces pale as candle wax in the dim light filtering through narrow windows. One girl, no older than 5, struggles with her robes. You want to help her, but you remember what happened to Margaret when she whispered comfort to a crying child last week. 3 days without food. 3 days kneeling on dried peas scattered across the chapel floor until her knees bled through her stockings. This is not a school. This is not a sanctuary. This is Whitby Abbey in Yorkshire, England, in the year 1247 AD, and you are trapped here not by choice, but by the political machinations of your father, who needed to secure an alliance with the church. Your childhood ended the moment those heavy oak doors closed behind you 6 months ago. You will never see your mother again. You will never run through fields or laugh without permission. You will never taste honey cakes or feel the warmth of a hearth surrounded by family. Instead, you will spend the next decade learning that survival requires perfect obedience, that hunger is holiness, and that silence is your only friend. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Dawn arrives with the first bell at 4 in the morning. No sunrise here brings warmth or hope, only obligation. Children as young as 5 stumble from their straw pallets, their bodies stiff from sleeping on floors that never warm, in rooms where breath freezes and rats scurry between the stones. At Shaftesbury Abbey in Dorset, founded in 88 AD, the dormitory housed girls from noble families who had been deposited there like unwanted furniture. Lady Godiva of Mercia sent her youngest daughter Edith to this place in 1043 AD, when the girl was barely 4 years old. Political alliance required sacrifice, and children, particularly daughters, were expendable currency in the game of medieval power. Edith's story survives in fragments within the Abbey's chronicles, written by Abbess Elfgifu in careful Latin script. Parvula Edith, she wrote, weeps without cease for 3 days and nights. Her tears freeze upon her cheeks in the morning cold. She calls for her mother in the Saxon tongue, but we speak only Latin here. She must learn that her mother is dead to her now, and God is her only father. Picture these children stumbling through their first weeks, their hair, once carefully braided by loving servants, now roughly shorn to prevent vanity. Their soft silk gowns replaced by scratchy woolen habits that chafe against skin unused to such coarseness. Their delicate hands, once protected by fine gloves, now cracked and bleeding from cold and constant work. Lady Matilda Fitzwalter, sent to Godstow Abbey near Oxford in 1185 AD at age 6, wrote years later in a letter smuggled to her sister, "I remember the taste of marchpane and the feel of ermine against my cheek. Now I know only the taste of barley gruel and the feel of rough hemp against my skin. Sometimes I wonder if those early memories are dreams, for this stone world feels too real to have been preceded by any other life." Silence wasn't golden in these places. It was survival. From the moment of morning prayers until the final bell at night, speaking was forbidden unless specifically required for lessons or confession. Girls learned to communicate through glances, through the subtle positioning of hands during prayer, through the careful placement of their bodies in the refectory. A tilted head might mean hunger. A certain way of holding the prayer book could signal illness. A particular posture during Mass might indicate that someone was struggling with despair. At Barking Abbey in Essex, renowned for its harsh discipline, the silence was broken only by the sound of leather striking flesh. The discipline chamber was a small stone room where girls were taken for infractions as minor as smiling during prayers or moving too slowly during processions. Sister Ermengarde, who served as disciplinarian from 1203 to 1219 AD, kept meticulous records of punishments in her Liber Correctionum. Her entries read like a catalogue of cruelty. Alicia, age 7, struck 5 times with the rod for laughing during none. Marguerite, age 9, 15 strokes for speaking during the reading of scripture. Beatrice, age 5, held by the arms while struck 10 times for wetting her bedding. These weren't occasional punishments. They were daily occurrences. Children lived in constant fear of making mistakes they didn't understand were mistakes. Eleanor of Aquitaine's youngest daughter, Joanna, was placed in Fontevraud Abbey in France in 1176 AD at age 11. Her letters to her mother, discovered in the abbey's archives in the 19th century, reveal a child slowly breaking under the weight of constant surveillance and punishment. "Dearest mother," she wrote, "I have learnt to move like a shadow and breathe like a whisper. Yesterday I was beaten for allowing my thoughts to wander during matins. How do they know what I think? I fear they can see inside my mind. I fear they can see my dreams of home." Food was not nourishment. It was both punishment and control. Children ate once a day, sometimes twice if they were fortunate. The fare was gruel, black bread and water. Meat was forbidden except on the highest feast days, and even then it was given sparingly. At Wilton Abbey in Wiltshire, breakfast consisted of a small piece of bread and a cup of water. Dinner was barley porridge with perhaps a few vegetables grown in the abbey garden. Children who arrived plump from their noble homes quickly became gaunt, their cheeks hollow, their eyes too large for their faces. But hunger was intentional. It was considered a spiritual discipline, a way to bring the body into submission to God's will. What the abbesses didn't acknowledge was that hungry children cannot concentrate on prayers. They cannot learn effectively. They become obsessed with food, hoarding crusts of bread in their clothing, dreaming of feasts instead of salvation. Agnes of Bohemia, daughter of King Ottokar I, was sent to the Poor Clares convent in Prague in 1234 AD, at age 8. Her confessor, Brother Francis, wrote to her father, "Your daughter speaks of nothing but food. She counts the hours between meals. She weeps not for your absence, but for the memory of roasted fowl and honeyed wine. This is not devotion, your majesty. This is desperation." Winter in these stone fortresses was particularly brutal. Heating was minimal, limited to small fires in the chapter house and perhaps the scriptorium. Dormitories remained unheated, even when snow piled against the windows and ice formed on the water basins. Children slept in shared beds, huddled together for warmth, often 3 or 4 to a narrow straw mattress. At Nuneminster Abbey in Winchester, built in 1902 AD, the dormitory was a long, narrow hall with no windows and only one small fireplace at the far end. Girls slept fully clothed, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, and still woke with frostbite on their fingers and toes. Lady Isabel de Clare, sent to Amesbury Abbey in Wiltshire in 1248 AD at age 6, wrote in her adult memoir, "I remember the sound of teeth chattering in the darkness, like castanets played by invisible hands. I remember the girl next to me, Marie, who was barely 5 and came from Normandy. She spoke no English and wept every night for her nurse. One morning in February she would not wake. Her lips were blue as violets. They carried her away while we recited morning prayers, and we never spoke of her again. It was as if she had never existed." Death was common and unremarkable. Children died from cold, from illness, from malnutrition, from despair. Abbey records show infant mortality rates of nearly 30% for girls under 10. These deaths were recorded matter-of-factly, without emotion or investigation. At Shaftesbury Abbey, the death roll for the year 1209 AD lists: Johanna, age 5, died of fever on the feast of St. Michael. Marguerite, age 7, died of wasting sickness on the feast of St. Luke. Beatrice, age 6, died of consumption on the feast of St. Martin. No surnames, no family notifications, no elaborate burials. They were buried in unmarked graves in the convent cemetery, their lives reduced to brief entries in account books. Education, when it existed, was limited to basic literacy in Latin and the memorization of prayers. Most children learnt to read only enough to follow along in their prayer books. Writing was taught to a select few, and usually only to those destined for administrative positions within the convent. Mathematics was virtually non-existent. History was limited to biblical stories and the lives of saints. Science was considered dangerous, as it might lead to questioning God's mysteries. At Luckock Abbey in Wiltshire, founded in 1229 AD, the curriculum consisted of memorizing the Psalms, learning to embroider ecclesiastical vestments, and studying the lives of female saints. Lady Ella of Salisbury, who founded the abbey, wrote in her charter, "Let the young maids learn submission through Scripture, patience through needlework, and humility through the study of those holy women who suffered for Christ." There was no mention of arithmetic, no study of medicine or healing, no exploration of literature beyond religious texts. These children were being trained not to think, but to obey. Physical punishment was not only accepted, but considered necessary for spiritual development. The rod, the strap, and the discipline of fasting were tools of salvation. Children who showed signs of independence or creativity were beaten until they conformed. At Dartford Priory in Kent, founded in 1355 AD, the rule stated, "Spare not the rod, for it is through suffering that the young soul learns to love God above all earthly things." The abbess, Dame Joan Vaux, was known throughout England for her harsh methods. She kept a collection of willow switches in her chamber, each marked with the names of the girls in her care. Parents who visited their daughters noted the welts on their arms and backs, but said nothing. To question the abbess was to question God himself. Sister Marguerite of Hainaut, who served as novice mistress at Poissy Abbey in France from 1298 to 1315 AD, wrote in her private journal, "Today I struck young Blanche 20 times for questioning why God allows suffering. She is 8 years old and asked why her baby brother died, if God loves children. Such questions are dangerous. They lead to doubt, and doubt is the enemy of faith. Better she learn through pain than through reason, for reason leads to perdition." Sleep was interrupted regularly for night prayers. Children were awakened at midnight for matins, again at 3 for lauds, and again at dawn for prime. Their developing bodies, already weakened by poor nutrition and cold, were further stressed by chronic sleep deprivation. At Godstow Abbey, where Rosamond Clifford, mistress of Henry II, was buried in 1176 AD, the night bells rang so frequently that the children developed a strange, walking sleep. They would rise and recite prayers while barely conscious, their eyes open but unseeing, their voices joining in unison chants they had memorized through repetition rather than understanding. Lady Alice Fitzhugh, who spent 12 years at Godstow beginning in 1289 AD, wrote to her niece, "I learned to pray in my sleep, to genuflect while dreaming, to sing psalms while my mind wandered through memories of sunlight and laughter. We were like clockwork dolls, wound up each morning and set in motion by the bells. I feared that if the bells ever stopped, I would collapse entirely, for I had forgotten how to move without their command." Emotional bonds were actively discouraged. Children were taught that love for family was idolatry, that affection between friends was sinful, that any attachment to earthly things was an obstacle to salvation. At Elstow Abbey in Bedfordshire, where John Bunyan would later find inspiration for Pilgrim's Progress, girls were forbidden from forming particular friendships. They were moved regularly between dormitories to prevent emotional attachments. Letters from home were read aloud to the entire community to prevent private comfort. Gifts from families were confiscated and distributed equally among all the children, removing any sense of individual care or special love. Dame Clemence of Barking, who ruled Barking Abbey from 1173 to 1186 AD, instituted a policy of spiritual detachment that forbade girls from speaking of their families or their lives before entering the convent. "The past is death," she proclaimed. "Only the present service to God matters. Those who dwell on earthly affections will find no peace in prayer." Children who mentioned their parents or siblings were punished with solitary confinement in stone cells where they were fed only bread and water until they agreed to release their worldly attachments. Young Lady Maud de Brosse, sent to Achombury Priory in Herefordshire in 1235 AD at age 7, wrote in her secret diary, "I try to remember my mother's face, but it grows dimmer each day. Sister Agatha says this is good, that I am learning to love God more than earthly things, but I do not feel love for God. I feel only emptiness, as if something precious has been carved out of my chest with a dull knife. I pretend to be holy, but inside I am becoming hollow." Physical abuse extended beyond formal punishment. Children were regularly struck for minor infractions, pinched for inattentiveness, and slapped for showing emotion. At Romsey Abbey in Hampshire, where the future St. Christina of Markyate sought refuge in 1114 AD, the daily routine included what was euphemistically called correction. This involved the systematic use of physical intimidation to enforce compliance. Children learned to flinch at sudden movements, to keep their eyes downcast, to speak only when spoken to. The scriptorium at Shaftesbury Abbey contains a manuscript illuminated by a young girl named Adelheid in 1267 AD. In the margins, barely visible, she drew tiny figures of children with tears streaming down their faces. These marginalia were discovered only in 1923, when the manuscript was being restored. Art historians believe these were secret messages, ways of expressing pain and fear that could not be spoken aloud. The figures are crude but emotionally powerful. Stick children with enormous eyes, hands pressed to their mouths, bodies bent as if in perpetual fear. Sexual abuse, while not officially acknowledged, was documented in confession records and private letters. At Warewell Abbey in Hampshire, founded in 986 AD, Father Edmund the Confessor wrote to his bishop in 1278 AD, "I am troubled by what I hear in the confessional. Young girls speak of inappropriate touching by elder nuns, of being made to lie with sisters for warmth in ways that disturb their innocence. I know not how to counsel them, for they fear punishment if they resist, yet their souls are surely being damaged by these practices." Dame Agnes of Huntingdon, who served as abbess at Elstow Abbey from 1257 to 1281 AD, was investigated by church authorities following accusations from several noble families. Letters between Bishop Hugh of Lincoln and the Archbishop of Canterbury describe unseemly conduct with the younger maids and practices that corrupt the innocent. The investigation was quietly dropped when Dame Agnes provided substantial financial gifts to the church, and the accusers were threatened with excommunication if they continued their complaints. Lady Isabel de Fortibus, daughter of the Earl of Devon, was removed from Canonsley Abbey in Devon in 1284 AD after she sent a coded message to her father describing evil touches in the darkness. Her father, William de Fortibus, wrote to King Edward I, "My daughter speaks of things that cannot be named, of sisters who come to her bed in the night and do unholy things. When I demanded answers from the abbess, she claimed my daughter was mad with religious fervor, but I have seen the marks on her body, the fear in her eyes. I will not leave her in that place of corruption." Medical care was primitive and often dangerous. Children who fell ill were treated with bloodletting, purging and prayer. At Wilton Abbey, the infirmary was a small stone room with no windows and minimal heating. Sick children were isolated from the community and left to recover or die with minimal intervention. The Abbey chronicler Sister Mathilde wrote in 1245 AD, "Little Constance suffers from a fever that burns her flesh and makes her speak in strange tongues. We have bled her thrice and given her bitter herbs, but she grows weaker. The abbess says it is God's will, that perhaps her suffering will purchase grace for us all." Herbal medicine was practiced by some of the elder nuns, but it was often mixed with superstition and religious ritual. At Amesbury Abbey, Sister Beatrice the herbalist kept detailed records of treatments. For fever in children, mix wormwood with holy water and blessed salt. If the child continues to burn, apply leeches to the temples while reciting 50 Ave Marias. Should the fever break, give thanks to Saint Dymphna. Should the child die, give thanks to God for calling another innocent soul to heaven. The psychological impact of this isolation and abuse was profound. Children who survived to adulthood often displayed what we would now recognize as trauma responses. They had difficulty forming relationships, experienced nightmares and anxiety, and struggled with depression. Lady Margaret Beaufort, who spent 3 years at Maxstoke Priory in Warwickshire from 1439 to 1442 AD, wrote in her private devotional book, "I am 30 years old, and still I wake in terror when church bells ring. I still count the hours between meals. I still find myself moving silently through my own home, as if noise might bring punishment. The child I was in that place is dead, but her ghost haunts every moment of my life." Some children attempted escape, though few succeeded. At Godstow Abbey, a girl named Mabel of Gloucester attempted to flee in 1278 AD by hiding in a cart carrying supplies to Oxford. She was caught and brought back, where she was imprisoned in the Abbey's underground punishment cell for 3 months. The cell was barely large enough for a child to lie down, with no light and minimal food. When she was finally released, other children reported that she had lost the ability to speak coherently and would rock back and forth while humming tunelessly. Dame Alice of Normandy, who served as abbess at Malling Abbey in Kent from 1289 to 1305 AD, kept a detailed record of escape attempts. Her journal records, young Marie attempted to scale the walls during matins. She fell and broke her arm, which I take as God's punishment for her defiance. Catherine tried to hide in the hay wagons bound for Canterbury. She was discovered and brought back for proper correction. Isabel feigned illness to avoid morning prayers, hoping to be taken to the infirmary and thence to escape. All these attempts reveal the same evil, the unwillingness to submit to God's plan for their lives. The most heartbreaking aspect of these records is how systematically these children were broken. They arrived as individuals with personalities, preferences, and dreams. They were transformed into hollow vessels for religious devotion, their spirits crushed under the weight of absolute obedience. At Barking Abbey, the chronicler Sister Euphemia wrote with what seems like satisfaction, "Young Lady Philippa arrived last spring full of worldly pride and stubborn will. She spoke often of her silk gowns and her pet falcon. Today she knelt before me and begged forgiveness for her former vanity. She has requested that her beautiful hair be cut even shorter, that her meals be reduced further, that she be given additional penances. God has conquered her rebellious heart." This was not education. This was systematic destruction of personality and individuality. Children learned that their thoughts were dangerous, their emotions were sinful, their bodies were shameful. They were taught to fear their own minds, to distrust their own feelings, to submit completely to authority without question. At Romsey Abbey, the novice mistress Dame Scholastica wrote instructions for training young girls. The child must be taught that her will is corrupt, that her desires are evil, that her only hope lies in complete surrender to God's representatives on earth. She must learn to hate what she once loved, to fear what once brought her joy, to find peace only in absolute submission. The irony is that many of these children were from wealthy, powerful families who could have provided them with excellent